it's easy to think chronocentrically, like this is particularly insane, but there have been times in the past when things have been crazy and we've gotten through them. We being most people. We're going to talk about transportation today, transportation impacts of the second coming of Donald Trump in the presidency on the day of the address to Congress, which is I just learned is not the State of the Union yet, his first year. And I'm just thrilled to have James Fallows here and Jim Montavali, who have been on well, both are really good journalists who've been working for a very long time on tough questions. James Fallows, across the spectrum of issues that we face on this planet, but he's been digging in a lot lately on aviation. He's a very seasoned pilot himself, has written about that extensively, including in a book. And Jim Montavali, I've known since forever. When I lived in the Hudson Valley, he's in Connecticut and has been doing green reporting and car reporting for, gosh, could it possibly be 50 years? It's getting up there. Yes. So we're all lifers here. I guess this is the deal. James, I thought maybe we'd start with a little general view because you have a wide view of these issues, and then we'll zoom in on aviation and transportation more specifically. But James, when you wake up in the morning, like right now, what button do you push, and what do you think in terms of navigating this terrain that we're facing?
Well, thank you very much, Andy. And please, I write as James, but I exist as Jim. So you can have two Jims and an Andy here. So
okay, good.
And so, in the broadest sense, when I was in college many eons ago, back in the late 1960s, I studied American history and literature. And the question that's been on my mind essentially in all of my intellectual and journalistic pursuits since then, including living outside the US for about a dozen years, has been, is America going to make it? Just because there are so many strengths and assets the U.S. has, and so many ways it keeps harming itself. And this is an unusual chapter in that saga. So what I'm doing is just trying every day to think how to keep part of the brain absorbed on the larger issues, protecting most of the brain from the distraction of every single second, and then directing our activities to where there seems to be some kind of leverage or possibility or something that will look good in history's perspective rather than bad. So that's what I think about when I'm not thinking about aviation.
Yeah, that idea of trying really hard to step back from the great attractors that are out there, these issues that Trump loves to get our attention around, and keep your own focus personally on things where you can get some actual traction, as opposed to just spinning and retweeting and the like. Seems right. And also in your 20s, you were a speechwriter for a president.
Yes.
A wonderful man who passed away recently, Jimmy Carter. And when you think about the young people around Trump these days, this is totally off of our conversation, but I just was thinking I'd ask you this. What resonates there? He's got these minions in a bubble, and
so it is. So I'll be listening to this speech tonight, which, as you said, is technically not a State of the Union because that only applies to the one that the president is given after he or she has been in for more than a year. This is a joint address. I wrote a number of these when I was working for Carter, and there's a whole realm of things, the kind of normal concerns you have about a State of the Union or joint session address, which is usually they become really a huge laundry list since every part of the government wants to have its paragraph or its sentence in the speech. And usually presidents are striving for some kind of phrase that will identify, that they can coin to have people listen to them and frame their efforts over the next few years. What we're going to hear tonight, God knows. I don't know whether it's going to be another MAGA rally speech or invective or whatever. And the difference between all those State of the Unions from the beginning onward, all of which I have read. I'm probably the only person who you've come across who can say that and is still living, just because in preparing for doing them and writing about them. The difference between that and what we're likely to hear tonight, those who listen, is similar to the difference between the young people around Trump these days and the young people who typically are in a new president's staff. And there's an interesting reason for that, which is that most presidential candidates, when they're starting their campaigns in the primary, most of them are going to lose because that's just how it is. Only one person's going to emerge. And so there's a bias towards people in their 20s who have sort of nothing better to do and can work for free and live in campaign hotels, as I did in the 76 campaign and then in the White House, working for Carter. And what is different this time is there's never, to my knowledge, been a figure like Elon Musk. Essentially no official position, but apparently the most, just disposing things at his whim, and the apparently zealot people around him who are implementing these changes, the so-called Doge team. And the difference here is that most of the young people who've worked for other presidents, they had some political background. They worked in the campaign. They were getting out the vote in Wisconsin or whatever. These people, who knows where they have come from, their basements or whatever, and they have not even the leavening experience that normal people in their 20s have. So it is the Musk Doge team is more different from past precedents than Donald Trump is different from past presidents. And of course, Jimmy Carter and Donald Trump, the personal difference, I don't need to belabor.
Right. So, Jim Montevalli, I want to take you back to the early days and thinking about the intersection of automobiles and the other things we move around in and politics. You've just done some coverage and some commentary recently, including on Living on Earth on radio, about Trump and EVs. He's basically at war with these things, just like he is with wind turbines, for reasons that are beyond any real comprehension, other than that he latched onto them for some reason and can't let go. So just take us back a little bit through your journey in your radio work and your writing. And is there anything particularly different about right now? Oh, sorry, you got to unmute.
Well, particularly relevant is that I wrote a book in 2000 called Forward Drive, which is about the coming electric vehicle revolution that I thought would happen. And I got some things wrong, but I got a lot of it right, actually. And we basically had in the Biden administration a pretty solid move towards the administration supporting EV adoption. And through the Inflation Reduction Act, what Biden did, and unfortunately this didn't get enough play, is by tying the $7,500 federal income tax credit for purchasing EVs to the cars being made in the U.S. and the batteries being made in the U.S., he triggered an enormous, that's the book. He triggered an enormous move towards factories, both auto plants and battery plants being located in the U.S. I mean, we're talking maybe billions, maybe even trillions of dollars of investment in these plants. So this is presumably what Trump wanted, which is the cars being sold in America to be built in America. And yet he has demonized the IRA, and he thinks that the tariffs that he applied starting today are going to have the same effect. But I think the effect that the tariffs will have is to make cars much more expensive for American consumers. And you have to keep in mind that the average car today costs $47,000. I mean, they're very expensive. Yeah. And this is because of the electronics we lard on them and all the bells and whistles. And it's not just because electric cars are expensive. The average car is expensive. The most popular vehicle in the United States is an F-150 truck, and people buy it loaded down with equipment. Yeah. I do have some numbers here that I think people would find interesting, is that just under half, 48.6% of all new vehicles were actually built in the United States. This is through February of this year. 17% were built in Mexico and 7.4% in Canada, 26.5% in other countries. So if you take Mexico and Canada together, it's like 25%. So And of course, we're not only talking about cars, we're talking about car parts, which is a lot of what we have that are made overseas. It's interesting to note that the Wall Street Journal, which is generally like Trump, did not like the tariffs and wrote about it today.
Right.
And I don't think there's a whole lot of support in economic circles for these tariffs or to think that they're going to have positive effects. They're just triggering a trade war, in my opinion.
Yeah. And when you add up those various things, it feels like, again, a rational look at what Trump seems to want doesn't seem to fit with what is going to make America great again, at least in
He
terms.
gets very fixed ideas, and it's very hard to deter him from those fixed ideas.
Yeah. I see David Kerley. He's in our green room, quote unquote, and he'll come on in a minute, which is great.
So, Andy, could I just say something more about
Yeah, for
tariffs
sure. That's a
following
whole
what
year.
Jim
Yeah.
was saying? Because
Yeah.
back in the 1980s, I was living in Japan, reporting Japan for several years. That was during Japan's rise on all fronts. And I was living in China for 4 years from 2006 to 2011. And I became sympathetic in that time to a certain kind of tariff. There's certain kinds of tariffs. You can say, well, because the Chinese are dumping in this or that area, or because the US, many of our leading industries have over the centuries been the beneficiaries of specific government programs, from agriculture with all the subsidies that go to that, to aviation, of course, which has been largely government sponsored, to biotech, et cetera. So there are circumstances in national life where sane, precise tariffs can be justified as long-term investments. But when you just blanket say, okay, our two closest neighbors and our two biggest trading partners, 25% across the board, it's just simply nuts. As I think the Canadians are trying very effectively to point out now. One of the Krista Friedland was saying last night that if she became prime minister, not likely but possible, her first move would be 100% tariff on all Teslas coming into Canada. So this is just insane. So I'm agreeing with Jim on this.
Yeah. And I want to greet David Kerley, who is now in the conversation, a longtime ABC, particularly correspondent, and who's been covering his Substack project is called Full Throttle, and again, we're in overdrive right now in terms of policy questions. You've done several recent pieces on EVs and Trump's policies. So first of all, just good morning, and hope all is well for you these days. If you want to weigh in, it'd be great to hear from you a little bit. And just make sure you hit your unmute key, your unmute button. Find your mute button there. There we
Sorry
go.
about
Yeah. Well, good.
Yeah. The other computer didn't want to cooperate this morning for some reason, didn't like the link. I'm happy to join you. And I write a lot about what I call the transportation transformation that we're in, electric vehicles, batteries, commercial space, Mars, supersonic jetliners. And it is a fascinating time. And as you show, the title of my latest piece is The War Against Electric Vehicles, and it really erupted last week. I mean, we've seen, as you guys have been talking, how fast this has happened over a matter of weeks, and it's quite clear that the president is trying to roll back a lot of what Joe Biden did. And it seems not only does he not like wind power, apparently solar power and battery-powered electric vehicles, there's quite a bit of spite in this. I think he's really in an effort to undo a lot of what his predecessor did, and that I guess that carries through potentially to what he believed was his persecution through the Justice Department under Biden. But he's taking these very concrete steps that he can, as the piece talked about. I was really looking at the beginning at the difference between Elon Musk and the president on EVs and solar power, and then all of a sudden Trump went after the General Services Administration and told them to shut down all their chargers, which are the plugs number in the thousands at federal buildings and elsewhere that federal workers could charge the electric vehicles that the Joe Biden administration had bought for them and put in those charging stations. And also he had his transportation secretary, Sean B. pause the program that has been delivering about $5 billion to help. It's basically seed money to build charging stations on the interstates and in rural areas as well. So that program is being relooked at after not spending a lot of money, because it took them a very long time in the Biden administration to come up with the rules and regulations of would govern that, all that money going to private companies and states and localities to build their charging stations. So I think it was the move on GSA, and there's some reporting that they plan to get rid of the electric vehicles that were purchased in previous administrations. And there have been suggestions that the costs will certainly be in the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. One report thought it might be $1 billion. That seems a little bit large to me, but it's a bit about cutting off your nose to spite your face. It seems like it's going to have costing more to shut some of these programs down. But I think part of that is the president's effort to promote the programs and that help the oil and gas industry, drill baby drill.
I was just going to point out that Trump may support the idea of coal power coming back, but in his first term, there was more coal plants shut down than there was under the previous administration. And it is impossible for a president to change history in that way. Coal is not an economic source of energy. And I think electric cars are inherently superior to gasoline vehicles, and their triumph is inevitable. And it's beyond the scope of a president to be able to reverse history that way, though they can certainly do ridiculous things, as David was just pointing out about the GSA.
I agree that, I mean, pendulum swing. I mean, I call it the transportation transformation. We're well into this transformation. The rest of the world, China, the Europeans, I don't know, you might be able to slow it, but I don't know how you stop it.
And there, just to get another example of these trends reversing. So when I mentioned earlier, I worked for Jimmy Carter in the White House. Now he was the first president to sort of deal with oil shocks and oil shortages. He famously had his energy program, and he also famously put solar panels on the roof of the White House, which the very first thing that Ronald Reagan did on arriving was to have those solar panels renewed. So you can say, in the long run, the solar technology won, despite Reagan's gesture, because of the fundamentals of everything that is favoring solar now. But in the short term, it was quite a setback. That Carter thought he was planting a flag, and then for the next decade or so, federal policy was pushing the other way. So there are long-term trends and short-term disruptions.
There's a question that came in or a comment from Charles Rotter, who's a supporter of Trump, who's in frequent conversations with me on the internet. Charles says the tariff threat has already prompted Honda to move production from Mexico to the U.S. I don't know if any of you have a sense of weighing in on the macro picture of the pressures and whether there is some possibility that this may spur more of the reinvestments that Biden was trying to do, but in a different way.
Yeah, but my point was that the reinvestment in the U.S. was already happening with much more gentle policies, like tying it into the $7,500 federal income tax credit. Like James mentioned, this is a huge blunderbuss type of approach to put 25% tariffs on everything imported from Canada and Mexico. There was already a program that was causing automakers to move production from Mexico and Canada to the U.S. And it was working, and it wasn't as disruptive as this, and it wasn't increasing the cost of cars for the average person, which this is going to do.
the inflationary aspect is there, right? Exactly.
Right.
And could I just pile in there for a second? So,
Of course.
as I mentioned earlier, I think that particular tariffs on particular products from particular companies can have some countries can have a long-term effect. And so I've been in favor of these semiconductor protections and also some of the EV protections that Biden and now Trump are having about with China in particular. But there are things that are fundamental that you can't either short-term or even long-term move. Canada supplies something like 80% of all the potash, I believe it is, that's used for agriculture or fertilizer in the U.S. You're not going to move that to the U.S. Canada supplies a huge electric supplier, as you all know, for many of the northeastern states. Mexico produces way more avocados and fruits than the U.S. does. There are things that you're not going to move avocado production from Mexico to the U.S. So tariffs that have some rationale behind them, yes. Tariffs that just say, okay, nothing north or south of the border can come through, they seem to me to do more harm than good. And that is my
You know, in the mid 80s,
Yes,
mid 80s, the Japanese auto manufacturers did the same thing. I mean, the United States made it clear that things were going to have to change with imports, and both Toyota and Honda started building plants in the United States. So it's not unprecedented that Honda would move in, and you've seen it with the American automakers too. Manufacturing moves back and forth across the borders. Models move back and forth. They decide to build one model in Mexico and then bring it back to the States, or vice versa. So the point may be that, the tariffs actually did force Honda's hands. I don't know if there were any other underlying reasons, but it's part of what Trump wants to do. I don't know how that's helping American industry. It's helping Honda, I guess.
Yeah. There's the common factor here seems to be blunt instrument versus sort of carefully crafted policy. One would assume there's some sense by some folks within the Trump White House or sphere that there's a logic to going blunt and then pulling back where you need to. But the damage in the meantime can be enormous. And that's what leads us. Let's go into the aviation arena where you do not want to have blunt instruments at work. We've seen a number of incidents in recent weeks. Jim, I was rereading your piece on Austin, the close call at Austin. I just flew to Austin and left Austin, Texas's airport just last week. And I was after the fact, happily after the fact, I remembered that piece was about a close call in Austin. And here we have the Midway incident just days ago.
Oh my Lord.
I've had two of those touch and go kind of experiences myself. LaGuardia was one that I'll never forget. I don't know whether it was because of a runway close call, but Jim, maybe you could weigh in on, when you've seen what's been going on with FAA and TSB, and this is different than tariff policy.
Yes. So on the one hand, there's the big picture. Even today, as we speak, a U.S. Commercial airliner is about the safest entity you will encounter in your life. There are about something like 45,000 flights that take off and land in the U.S. Every day. Between the spring of 2009 and this latest tragic crash over the Potomac, there was a 16-year stretch in which there were no airline crashes in the United States. A total of 2 people died from accidents in that period, and there were like 10 billion passenger miles flown by the time, et cetera. So on the one hand, it's extremely safe. On the other hand, it is extremely safe for reasons that are the exact opposite of what is now being forced onto the system, because the system has been, its imagination has always been what could go wrong and what could go wrong after that, and what could go wrong after that, and let's prepare for all those contingencies and something more too. So there's been this sense of taking things as cautiously as possible and as collaboratively as possible, involving the airline companies and the airport managers and the pilots unions and the weather forecasters and the air traffic controllers and everybody else, trying to find institutionalized ways to remain in constant touch, and also to have ever more precise weather. The the slide you're showing right now, Andy, is from a post I did last night about the way that the biggest change in safety for U.S. airlines has been much more sophisticated weather knowledge coming from the National Weather Service and NOAA of where you're most likely to have icing dangers, or which airports at which moments are most likely to have this dangerous wind shear and microbursts from thunderstorms and things like that. And all these things together have given U.S. aviation its safety record. In the last year or two, there have been more and more indications of the system sort of coming under strain. There are more and more flights, more and more demand, a fixed number of runways around the country, a declining number of controllers as many of them retire. So there have been signs of strain, like that near miss in Austin a year or two ago, or like this thing at Midway, which could have been very serious. But what is happening now from the administration is a combination of big job cuts at the National Weather Service and NOAA, which are very bad, layoffs at the FAA, which also are bad, and a politicized, non-collaborative view, which also is destructive. Many of the informal consulting committees that would get pilots and airlines and the military and everybody else all together, they've been disbanded. That was something, one of them, Trump ordered that was something called the Airline Security Advisory Commission. His second day in office, he just abolished that, and to no apparent purpose. So I think that people in the business think, on the one hand, it is still remarkably safe. On the other hand, it is getting less safe, and it's worth paying attention because it's come close enough to the edge in recent years that luck has saved us. And it may come closer to the edge with these changes.
Yeah, and this gets to oh boy, there's the layers and histories, the lines of effort that have led to the progress are through what you call substantially soft infrastructure.
Yeah.
And you can cut away at it and you won't notice it maybe today or next week, or sometime there will be an event, as you've said already, where you will be able to start to say that weakening of those conversations. It's hard to draw a line back to a committee meeting, to some failure at a particular airport where an airplane collides with another one, et cetera. And we don't pay attention to systems too often, and to those soft things where you can't measure particularly the value in a concrete way.
Yes, and one reason I've been writing so often about aviation illustrations on this is partly it's a realm I know I've spent a lot of my life in. Partly it's something that captures people's imagination, because even though 75 people die every day in car crashes, people don't have the existential dread of that most people do about things going wrong in the skies. And so it's. But it also does exemplify what's happening in many other realms too. So I think that's been why it does have this soft infrastructure spillover. And I'll just say one other thing, if I could. As with say public health, when there are pandemics, you learn from them. As with anti-terrorism or law enforcement, when something goes wrong, people usually pay attention. And I think the aviation system has a stellar record of being very judicious and slow and saying, when something happens and people are killed, what can we learn to minimize the chance that this ever happens again? And that systematic, depoliticized, non-rushed learning is an example airlines have set for many other institutions. And I think it was undermined when the new president, the day after a crash, was assigning blame for it out of the blue to DEI. So that's defending the airline culture as an example of soft infrastructure as opposed to its erosion.
Yeah, boy, there are some people in Congress who seem to be making some noise about this. Jim Fallows, one more time. Have you gotten input and feedback, or do you get some sense that some of what Trump's early stages and Musk's early stage actions are doing that could be slowed down, reversed?
So if we're talking specifically about aviation, which is the place where I've had main contacts, the responses. So there's sort of two waves of responses I'm getting from people I know in this field. One is genuine fear that, again, the system is still so safe that something has to really go wrong to have the next crash. But many people, pilots especially, and air traffic controllers, those two groups in particular, I've been hearing from about just there is not enough margin. The margin is being reduced. I guess the other thing I'm hearing from some airline people is that the way the airlines are going to respond to this is going to be just slowing things down, because a lot of the things that are close in aviation now are in the interest of speed, that you have essentially planes landing as frequently as major airports as they possibly can at basically
Right.
1 minute intervals. And so if the margins are being reduced, airlines, to avoid crashes, are going to slow things down. And if the weather is less precise, they're going to cancel flights more preemptively. So
Yeah.
they are worried, and the system is going to have to become slower if it's to maintain its safety margins.
We hate that. We all hate that.
Can I
But
just make a
yeah,
parallel to the auto industry here?
yeah, and
The
then I want to get
federal,
to David too. Yeah.
the federal agency that looks at vehicle safety is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And there you have on the screen, you can see that there have been cuts there too. And cars have gotten really, really very safe, a lot safer than they've ever been, through, in some cases, mandates by the federal government that cars have, for instance, a backup camera. And you can certainly see the pace of regulation from the Trump administration slowing down, even as the technology improves to the point where it really makes sense to require certain safety devices. And also cutting the staff is going to have an impact. And I think cars were getting safer under Biden, and I can't see them continuing to get safer under Trump.
Yeah. In fact, I remember just a few weeks ago reading about this automatic brake issue, emergency braking rule, which is
Right,
definitely under
requiring
peril.
that. Yeah.
Hold on, my dogs are barking. David Kerley, can you weigh in on the aviation and transportation?
On both.
On the regulation
on both.
question, et cetera, too.
Yeah, well, before we leave NHTSA,
Yeah.
NHTSA, I've worked with NHTSA for years, an agency that's been through a lot and, has had a couple of really good administrators in the past several years. That is one of the agencies that has a number of investigations underway of Tesla and their full self-driving and some of the claims that they've made and some of the things that have happened, some of the accidents. And I think this is what some people point to when you talk about a conflict for Elon Musk. You just cut 4% of the staff at an agency that is investigating one of your main companies. On the FAA and the close calls, and Jim hit it pretty well. There has been a long-term, several years now, shortage of air traffic controllers, and you saw that the Transportation Secretary is, I think, what is a 30% increase in starting pay, trying to get some people to come in and start the process. And it is a very long process, and a lot of people wash out. It is not easy to be an air traffic controller, and it takes a lot of education, a lot of time to get up to speed. And I think everybody I talk to in aviation is extremely concerned, because it is such a layered approach to safety that when you start nipping at parts of it, does something fall through the cracks? I do believe some of these runway incursions we've seen, we had a spate of them a couple of years ago. that the one you just showed, I don't know if that pilot's still flying for that small carrier that crossed the runway. These are problems that have been a bugaboo for the aviation industry for quite some time, and progress has been made. And when we have a spate of these accidents, it raises awareness, and everybody looks again, and we seem to find some things to make improvements in. I would talk one thing that we haven't discussed, and this is the one place that I would have liked to have seen Elon Musk spend some time. It's called NextGen. In the FAA, it's the next generation of air traffic control. It includes, Jim has flown long enough that he's seen a lot of the improvements. It's kind of like cars, where you have the anti-braking system, all these driver assistance systems that come together to get you closer to full self-driving. And in aviation, GPS has been added, all these things have been added and have improved the picture. But NextGen has been this really laborious, expensive effort to modernize, computerize the air traffic control system, and it's just been plagued by problems and delays. And this is one place where I think Musk actually, in a calm way, could have actually added some interesting observations of how we're doing with NextGen to get to the next level of safety in aviation. But nibbling at the edges, especially on both of these systems, anything to do with transport is worrisome. We've made so much progress, you don't want to go backwards.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from each of you on this question of innovation versus maintaining. Well, versus is not the right word. Innovation while maintaining safety, whether it's on the roads or in the air. It seems to be a hard thing for societies to do. It's not what breaking things, moving fast and breaking things is fine. I was hailing Musk years ago when he was tweeting when one of his rocket stages was coming back to Earth and it fell over, and his immediate tweets were about looking for the failure and failure is good. But that's all done in a safe environment, without people in the way, etc. And I was saying that's something that kids should think about. Failing forward is great, But then this idea of breaking things like government agencies, while you might have in your head the idea of an AI having much more of a role, seems very counterproductive. So maybe we'll go down from Jim down to David again.
So I can talk about this important point about the dilemma of aviation and the FAA, where I agree with David that for reasons that are both, admirable and unfortunate, the FAA has been very slow in a lot of technological leaps forward. The admirable reason is, again, Elon Musk can declare properly every starship explosion as a step forward, and because you have to try lots of things until you see what works. You can't do that with commercial airlines. Again, if you think that there are 40,000+ planes flying each day, and even one of them crashed per day, that would be both statistically very safe and an absolute disaster. Airlines wouldn't exist if there were one were crashing every day. So it's a different mentality where all the layers they apply and have to check everything out. On the other hand, since I remember back in the 1990s, I was doing a book that was called Free Flight, about the innovations that the FAA, some of the visionaries in NSA, in NASA and the FAA were planning to bring to aviation routing, and only a few of those have come into effect now. There's now these ADS-B systems, so you have a much more precise idea of, pilots have a better idea, controllers do too, of what planes are where. But it should be much easier to have some kind of automatic routing of planes than it is of cars. The course a plane is taking through the sky doesn't have pedestrians. It has way more latitude from things it's separated from. It doesn't have stop signs. So it should be easier to have routing. The communication between controllers and pilots is still CB style where only one person can talk at a time. And in a couple of these recent close calls, both of the disaster over the Potomac and this close call at Midway, seems that one factor may have been if two people try to talk at the same time, a controller and a pilot, they can block each other and parts of a transmission can be missed. And there should be ways to avoid that with our modern communication technology. So yes, it is the FAA is cautious, and that's one of its strengths, but it can be slow in what it's doing. And if Musk had talked about ways to selectively work on that, then like a good tariff, that would also be of value. So if we could focus Musk's effort, that would be good.
Yeah, and Jim Montevalley, just in terms of this interface between innovation and existing systems and what comes next, what have you seen in your journalism over the decades?
Well, a good maybe an area to focus on is self-driving cars.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Tesla was an innovator in this place, and I think that there was a lot of ready, shoot, aim in the way Tesla approached self-driving cars. They put the technology on the cars before it was fully tested, and that led to NHTSA investigations and all that kind of approach. And I think we basically reached a sort of impasse with self-driving cars, that getting to the full self-driving is just not really possible with current technology. It's certainly moving that way. I think we'll eventually get there, but I think just throwing the technology out there when it's really not tested, and there were a number of horrible accidents involving Tesla's technology, and people died as a result of that. And I think Musk was very cavalier about that. And in the early days of Tesla, he was a very accessible figure, and I interviewed him a bunch of times. And I think you can sort of see the seeds of the way he's behaving now, but obviously it wasn't full-blown Musk, so it was quite a different time. But there's really rapid innovation happening in the auto sector right now, and it does need to be regulated. It does need to be stopped if it's not really ready to be on consumer vehicles, and that's the role of NHTSA. And cars have basically become computers on wheels, and to many consumers, the infotainment system is more important than the engine. And all of this leads to electric cars. That is the inevitable. That's the inevitable result of that. And again, Trump can't stop that, even though he's behaving petulantly about it.
David Kerley, you wrote about this potential tension between Musk and Trump over electric vehicle policy. When you think again about what we're just discussing, this idea of the balance between innovation, the transformation of systems, and the reality of keeping people safe, what comes to mind?
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable. I think Musk is now interested in a much broader portfolio than just electric cars. I mean, he's talked about sustainability. This is the guy that brought solar tiles to roof tiles, who's talking about big battery packs in your garage to store your solar power for your electric car. And I mean, Trump is the opposite of that from a policy standpoint. For some reason, Musk, I think because he's, getting to look behind the curtain of how the federal government, and he's got such access that he apparently doesn't care too much about what's happening to one of the industries that he's deeply involved in and one of his companies. I think I mentioned in that piece, sales in Germany were down, what was it, 30-40%, even maybe more. Here in the U.S. and California, 12%. It was interesting. Ford just announced their sales. ICE engine sales were down 10 or 11%, and EV sales were up 12%. They did have a lot of inventory they needed to move, so that may be part of the reason. But it's this dichotomy of a complete different policy view by the president than by Elon Musk. He doesn't seem to care, as I asked at the end of that piece, what do his shareholders think? And the stock has been under some pressure as well of late. I don't get it. I guess he figures he's getting other things that he wants, and he'll put up with the problems, or maybe he thinks he can convince Trump down the road. I mean, as I started that piece, move past and break things, and that's exactly what they're doing here in the first 5 or 6 weeks. I don't quite get it. But it's one way for Musk to say, I'm doing some things that are against the interests of my company because I believe in whatever he believes in, X, Y, or Z. I find it a little bit remarkable. The guy who's been touting the transition to electric vehicles is now in the midst of helping at least the federal government get out of the use of chargers on electric vehicles.
I actually heard that that Tesla has lost $330 billion in value, and maybe the world's richest man doesn't worry about that.
So this brings up something that we should get into, given who's on the call here too. Space policy. There is SpaceX too, and he's there's been several discussions of, and Starlink getting maybe replacing Verizon on some system too. Jim Fallows, looking at pulling out to the big picture. Do you have any sense of how long Trump will be part of this process, for example? He has a limited lifespan in this arena, maybe.
Yes. So on the whole space realm, I'm a big enthusiast of space in general, but I don't have any clear idea. I don't have enough sort of firsthand knowledge to judge the SpaceX role versus all the other the NASA efforts, et cetera. On the ways in which the Starlink proposal for FAA rivaling this one by Verizon, that seems to me an example of something that is, the FAA's caution is to make sure it tests everything for a very long time, and that's why it still has the handicap of having a copper wire network as sort of the operating system for air traffic control long after any major industries have done that. And so it is moving to the fiber optic. It had decided 2 years ago to move to the fiber optic system by Verizon. In the last week or two, there's been reporting that Starlink is being considered for this, which technically, I can imagine Starlink, a satellite-based system, being the proper eventual end for this. But the idea of a sudden change for a company, whose CEO is the head of Doge, that seems to me tricky. It seems to me sort of more nakedly self-interested than we'd allow in other realms of government contracting. So how long Trump and his people will be with us, someone looking down on us from heaven may know. I think these decisions will go for a long time. And so I have no good answer to your question, Andy.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Yeah, there's a lot of unpredictability in all of this. And folks in the financial and economics world seem to be concerned about that. The uncertainty is not the friend of the marketplace on all these fronts. David Kerley, back to you on space. Maybe we'll just talk briefly off the Trump news about the future, not just space, but you've written about supersonic aircraft, and so let's just go into some of the more non-Trumpy stuff for a few minutes before we close out. Maybe I'll ask each of you to think forward past this moment, meaning the next few years, to where the combination of technology and innovation, the soft infrastructure that Jim has pointed out so valuably, do you overall have a sense of progress being sustained? That would be something to close out on. But before we do that, let's talk about supersonic. I have in my closet over there a tie from my former brother-in-law, who was an investment banker, was going to London like every week from New York, and he got one of those ties for the Concorde that I still wear sometimes. And I used to think of it as like an artifact from the moment when we would go supersonic, and then we pulled back because of the crashes and stuff. But it feels like it's in unavoidable for humans to want to go faster, faster, and higher, higher. So maybe, David, can you talk about where we're going with aviation, and then we'll get to space?
Sure. It's fascinating. Of course, supersonic was fine over the ocean, but the sonic booms are a problem over land. I think the last time I heard one over land was probably 9/11, when some fighter jets were scrambling over the Chicago area where I was at the time. So there's this effort to bring aircraft over land, and to do that, how do you make the boom go away, or at least be quiet, a quiet boom? And NASA is very involved. They have a test aircraft they're building, and will be doing a lot of testing all over the country. And we also have some test aircraft by private companies that are actually already flying, and they say they've already done a quiet boom. So by changing the structure of the aircraft and the way the air hits the aircraft, you're able to reduce the noise. And that's the hope, that if you can reduce it enough, that at some point you would license these aircraft to fly over land, so you could fly from Los Angeles to New York. Instead of 5 hours, it might take you 2.5 hours to get there. A lot of things still have to happen to make it cost effective, and the ability to get on an aircraft. United Airlines has already ordered a bunch of these aircraft, and they hope to use them in the future. You'd have to say that there's been some progress. I mean, and I think with NASA coming on with their aircraft, but before the end of our lives, I think we're likely to see supersonic aircraft again, and supersonic aircraft flying over land.
Has Trump now demanded a supersonic Air Force One?
Not yet. He can't get the new Air Force One from Boeing. It's several years. I was in Seattle covering Boeing with the current Air Force One was being built, couple of them, and boy, it's deja vu all over again. It's a very difficult aircraft to build because of all the hardening and the wiring and everything else, and Boeing is once again having trouble getting that aircraft out of the hangar.
Mm. Jim, as a pilot and as a journalist, what's your sense of the future?
So I'll say I've flown in a supersonic aircraft only once. That was years ago when I'd written about the F-15. And the Air Force wanted to give me a demo ride in the rear seat of an F-15 during mock combat drills to convince me that it actually was more maneuverable than I had said. And they succeeded in making me throw up, which was the goal. I think that for the last 30 or 40 years in aviation, the innovation has been, in a sense, incremental, making airliners steadily more fuel efficient, steadily a little bit faster, better connected, safer, more resilient. But I think that a lot of the innovation going on now is on things we could think of as more breakthroughs, whether it is having some kind of electric propulsion, which is harder for airplanes because of the energy density of a pound of gasoline or of kerosene versus a pound of battery. But there's real innovation there, and also the ways of trying to deal with supersonic limits. I've spent time with this Boom Aviation, the ironically named Boom Aviation out of Colorado, which had this recent lower noise flight that said. So I think that we're ready. Probably the next decades or two, we'll see more of these ambitious innovations, like what Elon Musk has done, to his credit, with the reusable spacecraft, which I think he's been the real pioneer of. So I'm hoping for more big steps in the next decade or two.
And Jim Montevali, I remember when I was at Science Digest magazine in the early 80s, I wrote some piece about what's now, you're seeing these drones that are kind of the size of something you could fly a person in instead of a helicopter. And the line between a car and aviation was changing.
Actually, I want to mention that because we're getting close to the electric air taxi, which is in many ways a big drone. And these things have been in the works could be on to 20 years. It's sort of an extension of the idea of the flying car. And I think the initial idea was that these commuting vehicles would be autonomous, but everything autonomous is not moving as fast as people thought it would. So these are going to be piloted, at least in the early stage. And the idea is that it's a fast way to commute over the congestion and all that. And I think a lot of big companies have gotten involved in it. And I do think it's going to get launched pretty soon. But the other thing I wanted to mention, which I think is very important, is that there is a 2035 deadline in the EU and in several American states, including California and New York, for the end of internal combustion.
Mm.
This is on a total collision course with Trump, obviously.
Right.
And what Trump is trying to do is to revoke California's ability to set separate fuel economy standards. He tried to do that in his first term unsuccessfully. And I'm not sure he'll be more successful doing that this time. But there's basically a hard stop. I mean, you can't take it's hard to see companies continuing to only build internal combustion once Europe no longer allows them on the road. And California and New York, which probably represent 40 or 50% of the whole auto market anyway. So I'm seeing a slight amount of weakening in the resolve to do the 2035 ban on internal combustion, but it's certainly not going away anytime soon, unless it's Trump succeeds in derailing it.
Well, we'll have to revisit some of these questions. This has been a really valuable initial conversation on the path of transportation, innovation, safety going forward through these months and years, in which so far the blunt instrument of Trumpian, Muskian policy is clearly not in your interest if you like to step onto an airplane or drive on a highway without thinking too much about the safety of the situation around you.